He didn't even know what he was looking at. David stepped out of his car and time stopped. There, on the icy ground near the front gate, was a boy, thin, barely dressed, arms wrapped around someone. And then he saw her face, his mother, barefoot, cold, slumped in the boy's arms like a child, her silver hair tangled, her lips turning blue, and around both of them, a small blanket, damp and fraying, too thin to save anyone. David didn't think. He just ran, slipped on the driveway, cried out her name. His breath caught in his throat as he dropped to his knees. "Mom?" The boy looked up. His voice was barely more than a whisper. She was shaking. She didn't know where she was. I couldn't leave her. And then he passed out. That's when David felt something break inside of him. David Scott was a billionaire, CEO, powerhouse, feared in every boardroom from London to New York. But that morning, as he held his unconscious mother in one arm and a homeless teenage boy in the other, none of it mattered. Not the mansion behind him, not the empire he'd built, not the money, the titles, the life he thought was secure. All that remained was a question. How did this happen? How did a boy with nothing risk everything to save the one person David should have protected? How did a stranger in the snow end up doing what a son could not? And why did it feel like God had sent him? Before we begin this story, please pause for just a moment. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever questioned where God was in the middle of your storm, or if you've ever seen love show up in the most unexpected place, then this story is for you. Click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes God sends angels in rags, and sometimes they're the ones who save us. The ambulance lights hadn't arrived yet. There was only the sound of wind, thick, sharp, and bitter against David's skin. He couldn't stop shaking, not from the cold, but from the sight of it. His mother's feet were purple, not bruised, frozen. Her nightgown was stuck to her legs, the hem caked in frost. She wasn't moving except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest, barely breathing. And this boy, this stranger, was still wrapped around her, as if protecting her from a world that had already taken too much. David's knees hit the ground with a thud. His hand reached for her wrist, ice cold, but her pulse was there, faint. The boy didn't speak. He couldn't. His head drooped against Margaret's shoulder, lips cracked, eyes half closed. His breath came in stutters, every exhale a silent cry for help. David had no idea who he was, but something about the way the boy held her, gentle, desperate, made David's heart twist in ways he didn't understand yet. He tore off his coat and wrapped it around both of them. Then he reached for his phone, fingers trembling, voice unsteady. "Emergency. 2 people, hypothermia. My mother, a teenage boy. Send someone now, please." The call ended. Seconds passed like hours. He tried to lift his mother, but her limbs were stiff. So he stayed on the ground, one arm around her, one arm around the boy. And somewhere between the silence and the snow, David began to pray. He hadn't prayed in years, not since his father's funeral, not since he stopped believing that God still paid attention to people like him, people who chose money over meaning, deals over dinners, success over family. But now none of that mattered. He whispered it like a confession. "God, please, don't take her, not like this." The boy let out a soft groan, almost inaudible. David leaned closer. She was lost, the boy rasped. She didn't know where she was. His words cracked like glass. "I couldn't leave her." And just like that, he went still. David caught him, lowering him gently onto the snow. The boy's fingers were still curled around Margaret's blanket. So old, so thin, it looked more like a memory than a piece of fabric. David looked at it closely. A faded flower stitched into one corner. Hand sewn, a mother's stitch. That's when something pierced his chest, not fear. Guilt. He'd hired security, cameras, a care team. He paid for everything to keep her safe. Except his own presence. Except the one thing she needed most. His face fell into his hands. "Mom," he whispered, broken. A sound came from the driveway. Sirens. Blue and red light flickered across the snowbanks, painting shadows across the stone pillars of the gate. David stood as the paramedics jumped out. They didn't ask questions, they could see it in the boy's face, the woman's skin, the blanket between them. They moved quickly, wrapping his mother in warming sheets, checking vitals, lifting her onto the stretcher. Then came the boy. "He's colder than she is," one of them said. They placed him on a second stretcher. David followed them both, not thinking. He opened the back of the ambulance and climbed in, one hand on his mother's arm, one hand resting over the boy's chest. He didn't know who he was, didn't know where he came from, but something deep inside told him. This wasn't a random act of kindness. This was something else. Maybe it was grace, maybe it was judgment, maybe it was God finally getting his attention. The doors shut. The ambulance drove off, and in the quiet hum of that ride, as snow tapped gently against the windows, David Scott sat between two lives he had never imagined would be connected, the mother who gave him everything, and a boy who had nothing, but gave her back to him. He bowed his head again, not from shame, but from a holy kind of awe, the kind that tells you, your life is about to change forever. Christopher hadn't spoken again, but his silence said enough. And as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, David's mind wasn't on meetings, it wasn't on money. It was on a question he couldn't stop hearing. Who is he? And somehow, he already knew. This boy wasn't here by accident. The wind cut through the alley like a blade. Christopher pulled his mother's blanket tighter around his shoulders, though the truth was it hadn't held in warmth for years. It just reminded him of her. The fabric was thin now, patched in two corners with the smell of old soap still clinging to it. He hadn't slept. There wasn't anywhere safe to. Not really. Not when your last roof was a broken-down boarding house and your name wasn't on any lease. He'd been evicted that morning. Quietly. Without a scene. Just a soft apology from the landlord who'd looked tired of feeling sorry for him. "I gave you a few extra days, kid, but I've got a business to run." Christopher didn't argue. He just nodded, took the few things he owned, a backpack, a water bottle, 2 shirts and that old blanket, and stepped out into the cold. The sun was still low in the sky then, the kind of December morning where the cold settles into your bones before you've even taken your first step. He walked for hours, hands deep in his pockets, hood pulled low. He passed diners where people were laughing over pancakes, walked by warm houses with wreaths in the windows. He saw fathers helping their kids build snowmen, steam rising from mugs on porches. He didn't hate them. He didn't feel envy. Mostly, he felt invisible. At one point, his stomach cramped from hunger. He reached into his pocket and felt the last 2 bills he had, $3, wadded and damp from the snow. He could have gone to a fast food place, but he didn't want to sit there under fluorescent lights pretending to belong. So he kept walking. His path took him into one of the wealthier neighborhoods on the edge of town. Big stone houses, electric gates, driveways longer than some streets. He didn't mean to end up there. He just followed the quiet. And then he heard something, a sound carried faintly on the wind, crying, fragile, frightened. He stopped. It came again, a woman's voice, lost, disoriented. He followed it down a narrow path between 2 hedges toward the side gate of a large estate. And there she was, an elderly woman, standing in the snow. Her nightgown clung to her thin frame. Her hands trembled around a photo frame. The glass cracked. She was barefoot. "Ma'am?" Christopher called out gently. She didn't respond, just looked past him like she wasn't fully there. "I have to catch the train," she whispered. "James is waiting. I'm late." Her eyes were cloudy, darting left and right, searching a world only she could see. Christopher moved slowly toward her, keeping his voice low. "What's your name?" "Margaret," she said after a pause. "I think." He stepped closer. She didn't flinch, but she looked so small, so fragile, like the wrong gust of wind might blow her over. "You're cold," he said softly. "Let me help you." She nodded, almost like a child being told it was time to go home. He took off his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Then he unwrapped the blanket from his own body and held it over both of them. "Where do you live, Margaret?" She looked around, lost. "Somewhere close, I think. But it doesn't feel right. Nothing feels right." He thought about calling someone. But who? He had no phone. And even if he did, he'd learned the hard way that people like him didn't get the benefit of the doubt. A black teenager with no address and no ID, found alone with an elderly white woman who couldn't explain who he was. That didn't end well. Ever. He couldn't risk the police. But he also couldn't leave her. So he did the only thing that felt right. He stayed. He helped her walk to a small alcove near the front gate. Stone walls on 3 sides, just enough to block the wind. He sat down first, then helped her sit beside him. He wrapped the blanket around their shoulders and held her close, trying to give her what warmth he could. For hours they sat like that, huddled together, breathing into the cold. He told her stories about his mum, how she used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, how she'd sing while washing dishes, off-key but full of joy, how she used to say, "Being poor ain't the worst thing. Being cruel is." Margaret didn't always respond, but sometimes she smiled. And just before her eyes began to close, she whispered, "You're good. Your mother would be proud." Christopher swallowed hard. "I promised her I'd stay kind," he said quietly, "even when the world wasn't." He tightened the blanket around her shoulders, and then he closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because there was nothing else he could do, except stay. Snow fell quietly around them, covering the blanket, the alcove, the photo frame in her hands. And in the silence between them, something holy was happening, though no one else saw it yet. God had already begun the rescue. The snow didn't stop. It fell heavy now, thick and fast, brushing against Christopher's face like icy fingers. He blinked it away, but his eyelashes were starting to freeze. Margaret had stopped speaking. She was curled against him in the alcove, her body growing stiller by the minute, her breath shallow, her hands limp. He'd wrapped the blanket around both of them as tightly as he could, tucking it under her legs, under her back. Still, she shivered. He'd never been this cold before, not even on the nights he'd slept behind church buildings or in alleyways between dumpsters. Not even when he'd spent a week on the roof of a bus stop, trying to stay off the streets after the shelter closed down. This was different, because now it wasn't just his body shutting down, it was hers. He leaned in closer, pressing his chest against her back, trying to shield her with what little strength he had left. His own jacket had stopped helping hours ago. The lining was torn, the zipper broken, but he didn't care. He didn't need it. She did. He looked down at her face. There was snow in her hair. Her skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and for a moment, he panicked. "Margaret?" No answer. He shook her gently. "Margaret, hey, you still with me?" A pause, a breath. Then, "I'm just tired," she whispered. Her voice sounded far away, smaller, like a child's. He pressed his forehead against the side of her head. "You gotta stay awake, okay? Just a little longer." She didn't reply. He searched the street again. Nothing. No lights, no sound, no movement. He hadn't seen a single car pass since they sat down. It was like the world had closed its eyes. He whispered to her again, "Tell me something, anything, a memory. Your son, what's he like?" Margaret stirred. Her lips moved slowly. "David, he had curly hair, just like his father, always wanted to climb things." Christopher smiled softly. "That's good. Keep going." "He used to sing to me," she murmured, "when he was small, before the world got too loud." Then she was quiet again. Christopher clenched his jaw. The cold was making it hard to think now. He could feel his fingers going numb, his toes too. The kind of numb that wasn't normal, the kind that made you worry if they'd come back. He thought about leaving, just for a minute, to find help, knock on a door, bang on a window. But every time he started to shift away, Margaret whimpered, and every time she did, his chest ached. He couldn't leave her. She was someone's mother. She was his mother, in a way that only made sense in moments like this. He reached into his bag and pulled out the only other thing he had, a small zippered pouch that held the photo of his mom, and the harmonica she gave him before she died. He couldn't play anymore, his lips too cold, his breath too shaky, but he held it anyway. "I used to play this for my mum," he said aloud, voice soft, "when she was in the hospital. She said music made the pain float." Margaret didn't respond, but he kept talking. "She used to say, 'Gee, you'll never be poor if you still have kindness.'" He laughed once, bitter and hollow. "Didn't make sense to me back then. Thought kindness didn't feed you, didn't keep the lights on." He looked at Margaret's face, peaceful but far too still. But maybe she was right. Maybe this is the only thing that matters. He didn't know how long they sat like that. Minutes, hours. Time had no shape anymore, only cold and silence and prayer. He didn't speak them out loud, just let them echo through his heart. "God, please, just get her through this. Forget me. Just save her." A gust of wind broke around the corner of the wall, sharp as glass. Christopher winced. He pulled Margaret closer again, though he barely had the strength. Then, faint. So faint he thought he imagined it. A squeal. Tires. Far off. He lifted his head, turned. A car. Headlights cutting through the snow, approaching slowly, then faster. Christopher's lips parted, but he didn't speak. Didn't move, because his body couldn't anymore. His eyes fluttered. He looked at Margaret one last time, her face resting against his chest. And he let go. Not because he wanted to, but because his body had nothing left to give. The car skidded to a stop, a door slammed, footsteps, fast, heavy, running, and somewhere behind his fading mind, Christopher heard a voice. "Mom, oh God, Mom!" But by then the world had gone quiet, and the snow just kept falling. The hospital room was warm. David sat in a chair between two beds, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. The lights overhead were soft, but nothing felt soft about this moment. His mother was still. And the boy, Christopher, the nurse had called him, hadn't opened his eyes since the ambulance. Machines beeped gently. Monitors glowed. It was quiet, in the way places are when something holy or terrible has just happened. David hadn't spoken in a while. He didn't know what he'd say, who he'd say it to, or if anyone would even hear him. Margaret lay to his right, her face turned slightly toward the window. They'd given her something warm to wear, wrapped her in layers, placed heating pads beneath the blankets. The color was returning to her face, but her mind was somewhere else, still wandering, still far, to his left. Christopher. 17 maybe. Skin pale. Lips still cracked. He looked younger here, smaller. The blanket that covered him now was clean, white, hospital-issued, but David's eyes kept drifting to the corner of the chair where the other one sat, the tattered handmade one the boy had used to cover them both. There were still traces of snow on it when they'd arrived. It was folded now neatly, as if someone couldn't bring themselves to throw it away. David stared at it. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment. That first moment, when he saw them. The boy's arms around his mother, shielding her with nothing but his body. No name, no reason, no explanation, just presence. The kind of presence David hadn't given her in years. A lump rose in his throat, sharp and dry. He hadn't meant to become distant. He hadn't chosen neglect, at least not on purpose. Life had simply gotten louder. Board meetings, takeovers, flights, success stacked on top of success, until his world was too tall for anyone to reach him, including her, especially her. And somewhere along the climb he stopped calling as often. Hired people to stand in for love. Sent flowers instead of showing up. She'd always said she was fine, that the nurses were lovely, that she didn't want to be a burden. But now, in seeing her on that stretcher, blue and shaking and quiet, David knew the truth. She had needed him, and he hadn't been there. He pressed his knuckles against his lips. Across the room, Christopher stirred. His eyes opened, just slightly, blinking against the soft light. His breath shallow, chest rising with effort. David stood. "You're safe," he said quickly, voice quiet but firm. "You're in a hospital, you're okay." The boy didn't speak, just looked around, confused. Then his eyes fell on Margaret, lying motionless in the next bed. His face shifted. Fear, then relief, then something else, something David couldn't quite name. "I didn't know who she was," Christopher whispered. "I just couldn't leave her." David nodded slowly. "I know." They sat in silence. A long, full silence that said more than words. Then Christopher tried to sit up, but winced. "You should rest," David said. "I'm not staying," Christopher muttered. "Did what I could. I'll go after." David didn't answer right away. He pulled the old blanket from the chair and placed it gently on the end of Christopher's bed. "Is this yours?" he asked. Christopher nodded, eyes lowered. "My mom made it, before she passed." David stared at it for a moment, then looked at him. "You kept her warm," he said quietly. "You kept both of you warm." Christopher swallowed hard. "It's what she would have done." David didn't know what to say to that, but something in him cracked, not all at once, not loudly, just enough to let a little light in. He turned back toward the window, arms folded. "Don't leave yet," he said finally. "Please." "Why?" David's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because I don't think this is over." Christopher didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. And as the quiet settled in again, two men sat in silence, one burdened by what he'd missed, the other unsure why he'd been called to step in. And between them, a woman sleeping beneath hospital sheets, whose life had just changed both of theirs. The car ride home was quiet, not cold, not tense, just quiet, like something fragile had entered the space between them, and neither man knew how to hold it yet. Christopher sat in the back seat staring out the window. David didn't say much. He just drove, eyes fixed on the snow-covered road ahead, one hand on the wheel, one hand resting near the old blanket folded on the passenger seat. The same blanket Christopher had carried like a second skin, the same one he'd used to save a woman he didn't know. The silence stretched. As they pulled through the estate gates, something in David's chest shifted. He'd passed through those gates 1,000 times, but this time felt different. Not because of who was inside, but because of who was coming in. He parked near the side entrance. The snow had finally stopped, but the ground still crunched beneath their shoes. Christopher hesitated when he stepped out. His eyes flicked upward toward the house, then toward the edges of the property, then toward the horizon, as if deciding whether to stay or run. David noticed. "You're not a prisoner," he said, voice low. "You don't have to stay, but I'd like you to." Christopher didn't answer right away. "I don't belong here," he said. David paused, then gestured to a smaller path behind the house, toward the guest house tucked into the trees. "Come in for the night," he offered. "Get warm, rest. That's all." Christopher looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. The guest house was quiet, a soft two-bedroom cottage used mostly for business guests or distant family. Clean, private, simple. David unlocked the door, stepped inside first, and flicked on the lights. "I'll send up some food. There's a shower, extra clothes in the closet. Probably too big, but better than hospital gowns." Christopher stood in the doorway, not moving. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. David turned to face him. "Because you saved my mother's life." "I didn't do it for anything. I know." Silence. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve something," David said. "You matter, son." Christopher flinched slightly at the word. Son. He hadn't heard it in a while, not in a way that meant anything. He looked down, his voice quieter now. "People only let me stay when they want something." David shook his head. I don't want anything. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the folded blanket and placed it on the couch gently, like something sacred. Your mother made this? He asked. Christopher nodded once. She used to say. He paused, then finished, barely audible. Even if the world forgets you, God won't. David sat down slowly across from him. I think she was right. The silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full. David stood. I'll give you some space, he said. You've had enough eyes on you for one day. Christopher didn't move. He just stood there in the doorway, one hand on the doorknob, one foot still outside, and then, slowly, he stepped in. He closed the door behind him, not with certainty, but with a kind of surrender, the kind that says, maybe just for tonight I don't have to run. David watched him for a moment longer, then turned to leave. Before he reached the door, he stopped. Thank you, Christopher. Christopher didn't say anything, didn't need to. That night in the quiet of the guest house, Christopher sat on the edge of the bed, blanket in his hands, unsure if he was still dreaming. And in the silence, David stood alone in the hallway outside, one man wondering if he could give someone a home, the other wondering if he could ever belong to one again. It had been 2 weeks since the storm. The snow had melted off the trees. The air was still cold, but calmer now. There was sun most days, the kind that didn't bring warmth, but reminded you it might come back. Christopher hadn't left the guest house. David hadn't asked him to. There were fresh clothes in the drawers, food on the counter. Tutors came by once just to test the waters. No one pushed, no one pressured. But every morning, Margaret would ask the same question from her armchair by the window. Is he still here? And when David said yes, her face softened. He's a good boy, she'd whisper, then go back to staring at the wind chimes. Christopher helped where he could, quietly. He carried books to Margaret's room, set the table, took the trash out without being asked. He never lingered, never assumed. He moved like someone trying not to wake the house. But David saw him, saw the way he looked at the photos in the hallway, the way he paused before entering a room, like he was waiting for someone to tell him he didn't belong there. And it broke something in David, slowly. So one afternoon, he knocked on the guest house door and stepped inside with 2 mugs of coffee. Christopher was seated on the floor, hunched over a notebook. Working on something? David asked. Christopher shrugged. Just writing. David handed him the coffee, sat across from him on the rug. You've been quiet lately. Christopher nodded. David waited. I don't know how to be here, Christopher finally said. David studied him. You're already here. I mean, I don't know how to accept it. There it was, the confession under every quiet gesture. David set his mug down. This isn't charity, he said gently. It's not a favor. I brought you here because I wanted you here. Christopher looked away. I'm not used to people wanting me anywhere. David leaned back. My father left when I was 7, he said. I never really forgave him for it, not even after he died. Christopher looked up. I spent years thinking I had to earn everything. Love, approval, belonging. If I wasn't useful, I wasn't worth keeping. A pause. I think I've done the same thing to other people, including my mom. Christopher stared at the coffee in his hands. The mug had a crack in it. Are you saying I remind you of you? David gave a quiet smile. I'm saying, I see myself in you, and I don't want to make the same mistake again. The silence that followed felt sacred, but it didn't last, because just then the front door opened, fast. David's business partner, Eric, stepped in unannounced. David, I've been calling. We've got 3 properties falling through. Wait. He stopped. His eyes landed on Christopher, the couch, the notebooks, the coffee. This him? Eric asked, lowering his voice. The boy from the papers? David stood slowly. Eric. I just thought he was gone by now, Eric said with a sharp glance. Didn't realize we were running a shelter now. The room fell cold. Christopher's eyes dropped. His body stiffened. "I should go," he said quickly, rising. "No," David said, stepping forward. "You stay." But Christopher was already grabbing his things. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just moved like someone who'd been here before, who recognized the change in a room when it stopped being safe. David caught his arm, gently. "You don't have to leave." Christopher looked at him, eyes dark and quiet. "Yes, I do." He stepped past Eric and out the door. David stood there, the air in the room thick with everything that hadn't been said. He could still feel the warmth of the coffee mug in his palm. And somewhere behind him, the old blanket lay folded on the edge of the couch, waiting. The guest house was too quiet. The mug Christopher had left behind still sat on the table, cold and half full. The folded blanket hadn't moved. Neither had David. He stood in the center of the room long after the boy walked out. He hadn't said much to Eric after that. Just one look, sharp, cold and final. Eric had gotten the message. He left without another word. Now. It was just David. The clock on the wall ticked softly, but time didn't feel like it was moving. Not really. It just sat, heavy, unmoving, like the weight in his chest. He'd messed up. Not with what he said, but with what he hadn't done fast enough. He should have stepped in sooner, should have spoken louder, should have shut the door before the boy heard something that sounded too familiar. David sat on the couch and put his face in his hands. He was losing him, the one person who reminded him what mattered, the one soul that hadn't asked for anything and gave everything. David thought about the look in Christopher's eyes, not anger, not defiance, just something quieter, something older, the look of someone who'd learned over and over again that safety never stayed, that kindness usually had a deadline, that the moment you started to believe you belonged, someone reminded you you didn't. David leaned back and stared at the ceiling. How do you rebuild trust when you barely know how to hold it? He stood slowly, crossed the room and picked up the blanket, ran his fingers over the stitches in the corner. He remembered what Christopher had said the night he arrived. She made this, before she passed. Something about that line stayed with him, not just the grief but the care, the memory sewn into every thread. David folded it carefully, then held it to his chest, and for the first time in years he whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Later that evening the estate was quiet. Margaret sat near the window, holding a cup of tea with both hands. Her eyes were clearer today, not fully lucid, but closer. David sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she looked up. "Where's the boy?" she asked softly. David looked down. "He left." Margaret didn't respond at first. "He shouldn't have," she said. David nodded once. "I know." She took a slow sip of tea. "He reminds me of James," she said quietly. David looked at her, surprised. "Dad?" She nodded. He had that same look, like the world hadn't been kind to him, but he hadn't let it change his heart. David swallowed. "I think he's sleeping on the street again," he said, barely above a whisper. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then go find him." David looked into her eyes. "You think he'll want to come back?" Her voice didn't waver. "He doesn't need to want to. He needs to know someone still sees him." That night, David drove slowly through the streets of town. He didn't know where to look. Christopher didn't have a phone. No last name. No place. He passed the diner on 8th, the shelter gate near the train tracks, the alley behind the church where the Christmas decorations were still up. Nothing. Then, just past the bridge, he saw a shape curled on a bench. A figure wrapped in a too-thin jacket, knees tucked to chest, head down. David pulled over, stepped out. His footsteps were loud on the frozen pavement. Christopher didn't move. David knelt beside him, quietly. He didn't speak at first, just placed the blanket, folded warm, across the boy's back. Christopher stirred, blinking slowly, but didn't sit up. David spoke, voice low. "I didn't bring you into that house to fix you. I brought you in because you showed me something I'd forgotten, and I'm not letting you walk away without knowing that." Silence. Then Christopher whispered, "I didn't mean to stay. I just didn't want to leave yet." David's voice broke a little. "Then don't." They sat there on the bench for a long time, no promises, just two people in the cold, one who had lost too much, and one finally learning how to hold something that stayed. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something softer. Christopher had been back for a week. He still didn't say much, still kept to himself. But now, when David asked him to join for dinner, he said yes. When Margaret called for him, he came, helped her with her slippers, held her arm as she walked through the garden. Some mornings David would wake early, glance out the window and see Christopher on the porch, knees drawn up, blanket over his shoulders, just watching the sun rise. Something about the way he sat reminded David of his younger self, always halfway out the door just in case love turned cold. But the air had shifted between them. The silence was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with learning how to stay. The night of the gala arrived quietly. It wasn't flashy, David had insisted. Just a warm evening at the estate. Candles, music, friends, families, supporters. The Margaret Scott Foundation for Homeless Youth was being introduced to the world. Christopher had helped design the logo. He didn't ask for credit, but David told the team to place his name at the bottom of every flyer. Youth advisor, Christopher James. He hadn't told Christopher yet. He wanted him to see it for the first time when he walked in. That evening, Margaret sat in her wheelchair by the fireplace, wearing a soft blue shawl and a small string of pearls. David bent down beside her, straightened the blanket across her knees. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded slowly. "Do they know about the boy?" she asked. David smiled. "Tonight they will." Guests arrived in waves, handshakes, stories, warm hugs. But through it all, David's eyes kept drifting to the entryway, waiting for one person. Then he saw him, Christopher, wearing a dark sweater, hair combed, nervous. He paused in the doorway, unsure. David stepped forward, offering a quiet nod, not beckoning, not demanding. Just an open door. Christopher stepped in. The room felt warmer. Margaret smiled when she saw him, reached for his hand. "You look like someone I used to love," she whispered. "You still do," he said, kneeling beside her. David took the mic later that night. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. And for the first time, he told the story publicly. About the night his mother nearly died. About the gates left open. About a boy with nothing but a blanket, and the kind of love money couldn't measure. He didn't cry at first, but when he said, "He gave her back to me," his voice cracked, and the room broke open with silence. He turned to Christopher then, who stood quietly near the piano, hands folded. "Will you come up?" David asked. Christopher looked unsure, but Margaret gave a small nod. And so he walked forward, slowly, humbly. The crowd didn't clap, not yet. They watched him like something sacred had entered the room. David handed him the mic. Christopher stared down for a moment, then looked up. "I didn't know who she was," he said softly, "but I knew she was cold and scared, and I couldn't walk away." He paused. "My mom used to say, 'Kindness is the only thing that proves we're still human.'" Another pause. "I just stayed, that's all." But those 3 words wrapped around the room like a benediction. "I just stayed." And then, a standing ovation. No music, no grand speech. Just truth, spoken in the quietest voice in the room. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, David and Christopher walked down the long stone path toward the front gate, the same place where it all began. They stopped at the spot where the snow had been, where a boy had wrapped himself around a woman he didn't know. David looked at him. "Everything changed here," he said. Christopher looked up at the stars. "Because I didn't walk away." 2 years later, the house felt different, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The walls no longer echoed with silence. They held memories now, laughter, music, conversations at the dinner table that didn't rush. Margaret had passed away one morning in spring. The cherry blossoms had just started to bloom. Christopher had been the one sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, reading aloud from her favorite poetry book. She'd opened her eyes only once that morning, looked at him, then at David, and whispered, "You both came back to me." Those were her last words. She passed with peace on her face, with love on both sides of her, and with a life redeemed, not through wealth or achievement, but through presence. Christopher didn't move back into the guest house after that. He stayed in the main house, not because David asked him to, but because by then it felt like home. He still carried the blanket, the one his mother had made, still folded it every night, still kept it close, but now it rested beside textbooks, not under bridges. Christopher had enrolled in college, studying social work. "I want to be the one who sees people," he told David one day, "the way nobody used to see me." He volunteered at the youth shelter every weekend, helped kids find their feet, taught them how to open bank accounts, how to speak up, how to stay kind, even when the world wasn't. The staff at the foundation called him Mr. James, but most of the kids just called him Chris. They trusted him, not because of his title, but because of his story. On the anniversary of that night, the one that changed everything, David and Christopher drove to a small cemetery just outside town. They didn't speak much, just walked together to a modest stone beneath an old oak tree. Margaret Scott, beloved mother. Kindness is the proof of love. David knelt down first, placed a single rose. Christopher stood beside him, holding something in his hands. A harmonica. The last thing his mother ever gave him. He hadn't played it since the night he nearly froze to death. But today, he did. He sat on the grass, eyes closed, breath slow, and played Amazing Grace. Soft, broken, full, the wind barely moved. The world just listened. David didn't speak, didn't wipe his tears. He just sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. When the song ended, they stayed there for a while. Two lives that had once lived on opposite sides of a locked gate, now bound by something that didn't need words. Back at the foundation, a new boy arrived that evening. Maybe 14, thin, quiet, hands buried in the sleeves of an oversized hoodie. He stood near the door, eyes darting between strangers. Christopher saw him from across the room. He walked over slowly, not with authority, but kneeled down to his level, offered his hand. "Hey," he said, "I'm Chris." The boy didn't answer. "That's okay," Chris said gently. "You don't have to talk yet." He stood and gestured down the hallway. "Come on, you're safe here." The boy hesitated, then followed. Some stories begin with a miracle. Ours began with a blanket, torn at the edges, threadbare, but wrapped in love. It was never about rescue. It was always about staying, when it was hard, when it was cold, when no one else stopped. Christopher James stayed. And because he did, a woman lived, a billionaire found his soul, and 100 more found a home. One act of kindness can change a life. Sometimes it changes two, and sometimes it saves them all. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, that broken people can become blessings, and that love still finds its way home, then stay with us. Here at Elevated Heart Stories, we don't just tell stories, we share moments that lift the soul. Stories that remind us of God's hand in the quiet places, of people who chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. So if your heart is still beating a little heavier than usual, if something inside you whispered, "Don't forget this," subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because maybe, just maybe, you've been the one who stayed, or you're still waiting for someone who will. We're honored to have you here. Until next time, this is Elevated Heart Stories, where love still lives and hope never leaves the room.